Thanks everybody for being here. So we already had the intro, so we can get right into the conversation with Jeet and Nilanjana. When I had put a status update for this on Facebook, Ruchi Joshi commented like, should I show up with a cat and inject it with a speedball and let it loose in the audience? And I was like, I don't think we need to strive that hard to find common ground here. But, but honestly, like given the title of this panel, Dillis Billis, Bombay druggies, and the fact that you guys are both together on the stage right now, do you see any common ground, enforced or otherwise, in the sort of outsiders, characters that you have in each of your books? Outsiders, creatures that are often kicked to the curb by the larger big feet, as it were.
I'm always interested in the idea of putting 3 or 4 people on a panel, because nobody ever has anything in common other than the fact that we're writers and we live in Delhi and we kind of know each other. The books are universes to themselves, but that said, we are at a literary festival, and you need a panel to kind of tie up loose ends, and fiction writers especially know that nothing is too contrived, so here we are.
Well, except for the fact that Jeet would look damn good in a sari, so we should, try fusion experiments that way. But in terms of common ground, I suppose it's only a way of looking at 2 completely different cities from the perspective of people or people who are not people, who don't usually come out. But I think that's very thin common ground. Let's explore the differences instead.
But did both of you think of the books as a love letter to the individual city?
Certainly a letter, maybe not love exactly, but love's twin, which we all know what that is. The darker twin. Yeah.
My relationship with Delhi, if it had been up on Facebook, would have been, it's complicated, definitely. I went there as a teenager from Calcutta, and I think I spent 4 years complaining bitterly about the fact that I'd exchanged, in my mind, a city of books for a city of very large, garish swimming pools. The first place that I went to in Delhi, for example, had a bar out there where you picked up the bottles and they played different Hindi film songs. And that in itself was fine, except that they played different Hindi film songs out of tune. And so let's just say that Delhi and I had a rough patch to begin with. This wasn't meant to be a love letter, but it started in a part of Delhi called Nizamuddin, which I love personally because it brings the best of the city together. There's a gated community where the gates have failed, Delhi's relentless attempts to keep other people out just don't work in Nizamuddin, because there's a canal that everyone has access to. And there's a lot of open spaces. There's an ancient dargah out there. And over time, I suppose, as I started looking at it from the perspective of cats, kites, and creatures who don't have a voter's ID card and therefore don't have rights in the city, something like love came in, something like that.
What is a cheel?
Oh, a cheel's like a kite.
It's a kite.
Yeah.
Yeah, because often you get a cheel's eye view of the city. And I think it might be a love letter to Nizamuddin East more than to Delhi.
But for both of you, both of you were already doing a lot of writing, journalism, poetry, reviews and things before you ventured into the novel here. So what was I don't know if it's the kick that propels you into that area, or whether, the leap of faith or whatever, which finally made you think like, okay, I can possibly embark on a novel. Because there's that, there's the teenage college writer who thinks like, I will write a novel and embarks on it. But you guys were already doing a lot of other writing before getting into the novel
What you mean to say is we were both middle-aged when we finally did our first novel, right?
Which gives me hope.
Well, it's true. You know, I'm actually I'm past middle age. You know, and it's a debut novel, and I had been building up to it pretty much my whole life, but I never had the resources or the time or the space in my head and around my life to actually get down to something that required kind of sustained energy over a long time. And when the only way I could eventually do that was to quit the job I had, which was journalism, and I had various journalism jobs over 2 decades, each one worse than the one before. I worked for a number of we have all worked for insane bosses, but I had more than my fair share, I think, of insane bosses. And finally, something happened around 2004 when I realized I could never again work for another human being. And I didn't mind what it took or how broke I would be or how desperate I would get, but it would just not ever happen again. And it coincided with actually giving up drugs and alcohol and cleaning up. So I don't think it was such a coincidence, actually.
And fueled each other. In my case, it was part of it was karma, you know, and I'll explain that in a moment, but part of it was just sordid economics. I couldn't afford to quit working in my 30s. I couldn't afford the kind of time and space that you need to do anything creative. I was on this little treadmill that the freelance journalist gets into, where after a while, my desk was set up in Delhi opposite the Istri Wala, you know, and she became a good friend of mine. There were these 2 ladies who used to handle the ironing. And at some point, one day she came in and she told me sympathetically, she said, Didi, you know, we take breaks, but we look up and we see you, you're sitting there, you're working on the computer, you have half a cup of tea, then you forget about it. Don't work so hard. And you know you've fallen, you know, you failed in your life when somebody who literally sweats to earn their keep feels sorry for you. So to a certain extent, I loved the journalism I was doing, and I wouldn't exchange those years to a large extent. But I have to say that a lot of the work that I did in my 20s and 30s was of necessity, hack work. It's like, you know, you're writing prose for the yard. And I don't think it had occurred to me that I could do anything about this. The other part of it was, I was a book reviewer, and I said sometime in my mid-20s, with my nose in the air, I have no respect for reviewers who decide that they're going to write novels. I think that's really arrogant. You should do one or the other. And you should never say these things unless you want the gods to actually sit up there and say, really? We're going to introduce a couple of cats into your lives, and they're going to play havoc with your computers, and they're going to tell you stories, and basically, you know, that's it. That's the end of your neat, comfortable journalist's life.
So,
I was just wondering if we could have that mic a bit louder. I can't, maybe it's the stage.
but actually, a lot of that outside noise is also leaking in right now.
Just see,
Can you guys hear clearly? The back? Okay.
Is this better? Yeah, okay. Sorry, acoustics. Okay.
Yeah. But when you actually started, I've read interviews where you talk about the cats, the real cats in your life, and that. But do you remember the point when a story started forming around in your head about the cats? Because cat people and dog people, they always have very annoying stories that they tend to burden all their friends with about how.
Well, you know, that's actually a huge area of commonality, which is that addicts as well. I have a lot of good friends who are either active addicts or passive addicts or ex-addicts, and they're great storytellers by and large. But it's an occupational hazard. Cat owners, addicts, same thing. Extremely interesting lives filled with a lot of blood and scars at some level.
Were you a big storyteller before you started writing this book? Did you like to share anecdotes and stories?
Yeah, but no more than anybody, you know. And but I didn't realize that I had been saving up stories until I came to the actual, the physical labor of writing a novel over 4.5, 5 years. And I'm one of those writers who doesn't begin with an idea of, exactly how a book will progress. I know there are writers, I'm sure, right here in this room, who know exactly what each chapter will do and exactly how the arc of the book and all of that kind of stuff. I cannot do it. I don't know how to. I start to work on the book, and as I continue to work on it, I discover what the book is about, because the book tells me what it's about. And I also find that that's a way of keeping yourself interested. I would be bored to tears if I knew exactly what was going to happen, 5 years before I finished work on something. So I think it helped a lot in terms of the stories that I'd been saving without really knowing that I'd saved them, that when I began to work on the novel, and I had no idea what I was in for when I started. I had no idea the sheer amount of drudgery involved, actually, the kind of 9-to-5 job that it is. If I'd known, I might never have gotten into it. And that's really when the story started to bubble out from under the surface of the book.
So were these stories that you were saving in your head, or were the actual notes that you had been keeping over there?
No notes at all, no.
No.
Certainly not. No, just pictures, mental pictures, snatches of music, an image of a slant of light, afternoon sunlight coming into a dim room on Shuklaji Street, lighting up the dust, and the face of a very old man, a smell, the smell of cow dung and sewage and smoke, which is really the smell of Shuklaji Street. So all those things came together.
And so what was the starting point of the Narcopolis for you? I mean, was it a scene or an anecdote, or?
I got a fellowship, a residence actually, a residency for a month in a very luxurious place in Italy. And I was staying in this kind of very old villa with Picasso paintings on the wall and so on. And I had gone there under false pretenses. I told them I was going to work on a book of poems. But when I started to work, I wrote a chapter that was very clearly fiction. And it's the chapter called A Walk on Shuklaji Street that occurs exactly halfway through the book. And when that happened, it opened a dam, and all kinds of things followed. And I just followed where it led.
What about you?
In my case, it was very visual. When I hadn't realized that I'd been doing the research for the Wildings for perhaps 15 years before I started. And the first short story began in 2003. It was complete, a 6th chapter in the book. And I put it aside and I said, I'm not a fiction writer, so that was just, an accident, and we will never speak of it again. But I remember the moment very clearly when it came into view, and it didn't come into view separately. I mean, structuring it later was a different matter. But I was walking across the bridge that connects Nizamuddin with Jangpura, and standing in the middle of the bridge, I was looking at a clan of pigs, a clan of cats who were walking across and chatting with the pigs. And at some point, these cheels flew overhead. And it seemed as though the cheels circled the cats, had something to say to them, to the stray dogs. But there was this face-off, and there's these 3 sets of animals whom you think would be at each other's throats. And yet, while they absolutely weren't peaceful, everybody knew what their limits were. I suddenly had the sense of overlapping worlds, and everything flipped on its head. I had a difficult time for a few weeks after that because I walked around seeing the world as not human. And I can't express what a big shift that is, but let me put it this way. If you're looking at this room from the perspective of all of us who are in here, you're seeing chairs and a stage and all of that. But if you were up there, if you were a sparrow sitting up there, what you would see was a lack of food, a lot of perches, perhaps friends outside. There's a couple of stray dogs outside who are really sweet, and a couple of cats who seem to know each other really well. So you'd be waiting to leave if you were a sparrow, pretty much.
But it must have been also tricky because I mean, it's not just cat. You have the cat, you have the mouse, you have the birds up, and like you have to sort of keep changing your point of view.
I didn't have a choice. They walked in. They refused to leave.
But in terms of the language, and I wanted both of you to sort of address the issue of like how tricky it was for you to work on the language that you wanted for your book to describe the mood, whether you're talking about addiction or that haze that you wanted to convey through language, or whether you are in fact trying to write a language, whether it's jungly or whatever the language that the animals are conveying to each other and the sub-dialects of it, as it were.
Influenced greatly by Richard Adams' Rabbits and Watership Down, I tried to invent a language for cats. And, with made up words for, there was a word for the mew you emit when you go around a corner and you can't see clearly, but you know that something else is there. There was a word for the feeling that you get when the tip of your whiskers encounters something unpleasant and trembly, So, and the problem with this language is that while it was perfect in theory and while the words were perfect for cats, it sounded like a mixture of Klingon and Bhojpuri. So it just didn't work out very well. And the rest of it was trying to, I don't know how well I succeeded, and I hope I did, but it was trying to let the animals stay animals with their very different minds. There's a mongoose in the book, for example, who thinks not like a human predator or like a ninja mongoose, but she just thinks like an animal who was basically born to fight snakes and then eat them and then sleep for a long time, And the cats themselves, one thing I know, or anyone knows after you've hung out with cats and dogs, is that our emotions overlap. You can draw little circles and say, this is where human primate emotion or cat emotion or dog emotion intersects. But there's also a tremendous amount of emotional activity that happens that we have no words for. And yeah, I actually did invent a separate language for that, and that didn't work out so well either. So eventually I just went with what seemed like a translation, This is the animal kingdom to the best of my ability. It isn't the real thing, but maybe it'll get you there. It's like reading Russian novelists in English. What can you do? You just hope that the sled and the dogs and the howling of the winds and the ice stays in.
You have a cat, Mara, the kitten, who is clairvoyant. And it often, as I was reading those bits, I often thought that that's what the author of The Wildings was also doing, a kind of clairvoyance, but a clairvoyance aimed specifically at the animal kingdom.
Thank you. And about Narcopolis?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, about halfway through working on this book, 2.5 years into it, or thereabouts, I wrote the sentence that now begins the book, the prologue, the long sentence. And at that point, I realized that I'd found the voice of the book, which was long sentences, unspooling, with the sense that the writer himself didn't know where the sentence would end up. So, it keeps a kind of discovery and a kind of delight alive. And once I realized that, I rewrote the book with that idea in mind, that voice and that sound in mind, that rhythm in mind, with long sentences. I rewrote it because I realized too, just in terms of technicality, I realized that you couldn't write a book about opium with short, telegraphic, Hemingway-esque sentences. You would need long sentences that unspooled over time and that actually messed with time, that played with time.
So I think this is, since we were talking about the language, I think this might be a good point to hear a little bit from each of you in the book. Is there a little section you guys would want to read?
Start with a bit from the prologue that I was just talking about. It is 6.5 pages, but don't worry, I'm not going to read all of them. I will just read the first few lines. Don't be rushing for the exit in droves, in panic droves. I'm not reading the whole sentence, so relax, everything's fine. Just a few lines. Bombay, which obliterated its own history by changing its name and surgically altering its face, is the hero or heroine of the story. And since I'm the one who's telling it, and you don't know who I am, let me say that we'll get to the who of it, but not right now, because now there's time enough not to hurry, to light the lamp and open the window to the moon and take a moment to dream of a great and broken city. Because when the day starts its business, I'll have to stop. These are nighttime tales that vanish in sunlight like vampire dust. Wait now. Light me up so we do this right. Yes. Hold me steady to the lamp. Hold it. Hold. Good. A slow pull to start with, to draw the smoke low into the lungs. Yes. Oh my. And another for the nostrils, and a little something sweet for the mouth. And now we can begin at the beginning with the first time at Rashid's, when I stitched the blue smoke from pipe to blood to eye and out into the blue world. Thank you.
You know, when people were intimidated by Jeet's 6-page sentence, I just thought they weren't reading it slowly enough, that's all. I mean, ultimately it's just a bunch of words and you have to give them little pauses and stick with it. This is very different, not as well crafted, I wish. But it's a little section towards the end where there's an encounter between a mongoose and a young kitten who's met the mongoose before on his first hunt, and they're meeting again in a time of some darkness for the colony of cats. There's a war between the ferals and the other cats, and the kittens come out to see whether he can make sense of this. And then the kitten felt his blood chill again as a familiar scent came like an arrowhead towards him, the thick aroma of damp fir and cedar, a powerful, warning smell. The bistendo leaves rustled and Kiri stepped into Southpaw's path. Your paws sweat with fear, little hunter, said the mongoose. Tiny droplets of rain trembled on her silver fur, giving her an eerie, almost ghostly aura. Is it your clan that bloodies the morning? I had not thought to see the day when wildings hunted their prey across the border of sleep. Southpaw stared into Kiri's red eyes, wishing Meow or Hulu were there with him. There was an angry glint in her eyes that he had not seen at their first meeting. Far away, a mew he recognized all too well called out to some unseen victim. Run, meat! Run if you can. No? Very well then. Ratsbane. Kill him. Kill it where he stands. And Southpaw suddenly understood. My kind, but not my clan, Madam Mongoose, he said, trying to keep his fear out of his voice and wishing his whiskers wouldn't tremble so hard. The shuttered house opened up after the Bigfoot who lives there died, and the ferals came out this morning. The mongoose raised her dainty paws with their deadly claws, standing up as she sniffed the air. So that was... Apologies. So that was the stink behind the pool of blood, she said. I had wondered. And your teacher, the Siamese, is she not riding into battle? Will your clan not dance with the ferals today? For some reason, Kiri's words made the kitten feel better until he thought of how small their numbers were. I think, Madam Mongoose, that they will, but they are outnumbered. There are only a scant handful of wildings today against the ranks and ranks of ferals whom Datura leads. The mongoose's red eyes flared and she looked longingly towards the shuttered house. But then she dropped back onto the ground. This is between your clans, Kiri said, between the ferals and the wildings. And besides, I have hunted the night through. Perhaps I will come back once I have rested. They heard another set of screams rise in the distance, and Southpaw shuddered. Perhaps I will come back very soon, said Kiri, the anger dancing like flames in her eyes. And you, little hunter? She sized him up, her sleek head reaching out to sniff at him. No, she said. Old enough for first hunt is not old enough for first battle. But if I were you, I would bring the other cats. The stink tells me that the ferals surround your clan like flies around a broken honeycomb. A handful of wildlings cannot do much. Well, no, there is one thing that they can do. But in your place, boy, I would run for help. Southpaw watched as the mongoose trotted away, not sure whether to be relieved that she had left him unharmed or sorry that she would not stay to fight. Madam Mongoose, he called, what is the one thing you mentioned that my clan could do? The mongoose turned, and her red eyes bore into his hopeful brown ones. They could die well, she said softly, and then her silver sheep disappeared into the bougainvillea.
Now, one of the things after these books come out, obviously people, writing about them, draw the parallels, whether they're comparing, they're bringing up the Burroughs or Confessions of an Opium Eater or Jungle Book or whatever, Richard Adams, you mentioned Richard Adams yourself. But when you guys were actually writing it, were there certain books that were sort of your companions on that journey, or did you very carefully stay away from things that could influence your writing?
Well, the one book that was a companion on my journey is never mentioned by any reviewers. They mention all the obvious ones, William Burroughs. There's absolutely no connection with William Burroughs in my book because Burroughs is all about the experiment. It's fragmented. There's nothing linear. This is a very conventional story in many ways. The book that I returned to and turned to throughout the writing of this book was The Brothers Karamazov. And nobody ever mentions that, so I wouldn't set too much stock by what reviewers say. But then you know that.
But why did you keep going back to The Brothers Karamazov?
Because I wanted to write a kind of 19th century novel set in India, a 19th century Russian novel set in India. Because there are so many similarities between 19th century Russia and 20th century India in a dozen ways. And I always thought that kind of novel with digressions and often very insane digressions that eventually come back to the main story and make the story richer, the main storyline richer, with dreams, with visions, with 15-page dialogue or 15-page conversation about the existence or not of God. Absolutely unexpected little bumps and digressions on that road. I always thought that would be the way to approach a certain kind of novel about India. And when I began to work on this, that was the idea in my head.
Nilanjana?
I wasn't influenced by anything. I tend to agree with what anybody says amiably because at some point of time, I've probably read and loved the books that they suggest. So if it's Kipling, I'll say, yeah, absolutely. And if it's Richard Adams, I'll say, why not? James Herriot, we love animals, and it's fine. I don't really care whatever people want to see in the book is absolutely fine by me. The only book that was a major influence was Adams in terms of language, because the one thing that he did with Watership Down that blew my mind when I was an 11-year-old kid reading it was he did the alien thing, This is a huge problem for science fiction authors. You're writing about little green men who come from Mars, and how do you make them sound like plausible aliens instead of people in little green men from Mars costumes without actually producing a mind so alien that there's no way that we could relate to it, right? And with animals, what Adams managed to do was to just allow rabbits to be a little left of field. They were understood by us, but their minds were not human, And that's about the only thing. Influences, I think if you're a reviewer anyway, you're automatically inoculated against. It's like having a tetanus shot every so often. You read so much that there's no way you're going to be influenced by anything except maybe the Mahabharata. Maybe the Mahabharata's in there. I have no idea. I'm just going to say yes if anyone points that out. There's a bloody battle at the end,
And you mentioned even at Jaipur when you received the DSC prize, one of the things that that the initial reviews here for the book were quite negative. And one of the things you said was, it was the peril of sometimes the reviewer actually knowing the writer a little too well.
Yeah, sure. And some of those negative reviews were from people I'd known in Bombay back in the day who, back in the day when I was admittedly out of it. So, I might have done or said something that just made me a lifelong enemy. And eventually, at some point, they got the chance and they stuck the knife in. And, this is what reviewers do. Excuse me if I seem to be a little bitter about the great and honorable tradition of book reviewing, but I have good reasons.
Well, I had really great reviews for The Wildings, so I have to say that Indian reviewers are the best in the world, absolutely. But, okay, more seriously, I think one of the problems with the Indian reviewing scene, as we all know, is that it's really incestuous,
Yeah.
It's part of a large joint family. There are people like me who've pretty much stopped reviewing Indian authors at any rate because we can't do so with any degree of honesty anymore. So
is that a problem? I mean, there was a whole section, on cultural, literary criticism at Jaipur, and this was one thing that did not come up in the audience question, sort of this sliding door, because I think Christopher Ricks mentioned that one of the problems with review and criticism, unlike, say, the art critic, is the art critic doesn't necessarily paint, just review. Whereas with reviewers and writers, it's a much more gray, tenuous, sliding door relationship. They go back and forth. And he gave sort of the example of like, why should I be writing the criticism of this particular writer, and why shouldn't that writer be doing that for me instead? But here, do you think that problem is even more magnified?
I would say that you have some exceptions, and they show you what a good review can do. When I read either Jai Arjun Singh or Shupriya Nair or Dipanjana Pal, a handful really of, I don't review anymore, but a few decent critics, they remind you that a review isn't a judgment, You're not standing there with your little board saying you get an 8 for deportment and a 7 for good conduct. Well done, it's a great novel. That's not how it's supposed to work. At its best, it really is something that opens up the conversation between, you have the reader out there, you have the author out here, and a good review can work like something that just tells the reader, this is what you should look at as well with some intensity when you look at this book. Or when you read this book, you should be reminded of 5 others, and would you like to go and read them as well? And I just don't think that the way we commission reviews in India works that way.
Well, we commission them by saying, here's the book I want to review tomorrow, 800 words. What do you expect? You don't have time to read the book. You're going to Google and read the reviews. And, there's a way of doing a negative review where you feel honored, even at the end of it, because it may say no at the end of it, but you know that the reviewer has given you the gift of attention, which is a kind of love. To read a book carefully and to then say what's wrong with it or why you don't like it. And that's that kind of review, we've read those reviews, and really there is an honor there, and you feel honored as a writer to get that kind of review. But in India, when you see a book review, what you see most often is rage, a negative book review. What jumps out at you are the twin qualities of rage and envy. And that's just a very shifting kind of ground on which to base 800 words,
But that's sad because, I know you're sick of talking about reviews, but just one last thing. One of the satisfactions of writing a negative review, though, is that you only write it for, at least in my experience when I was working with Biblio and when we had the luxury of long reviews, 1,200 word, 1,500 word, 2,000 word pieces, you would only bother to do that for a book that you really cared about, The books that I ended up wrestling with were frequently books by writers who were really very good. People like Upamanyu Chatterjee or Akhil Sharma. And if an author like that draws forth your strongest criticism, that's because your point is not to pull him down or to denigrate him. Your point is simply to say, I loved your book so much that I disagree violently with certain parts of it because they made me really uncomfortable, and let's discuss that discomfort, And I wish that we had more people doing that, or we had more space for that.
But I mean, do not have this whole thing hijacked about book review. But I mean, even on the other end, even the positive book review is itself also compromised. I mean, I haven't read The Return of the King, William Dalrymple's book. It might be a fabulous book, but given what the situation is like, every time I read a review, I have no idea if the person is genuine in his praise for the book, or whether, you know,
or whether they want to be invited to Jaipur next year.
Exactly. I mean, it's simple. And, you know, and it's a disservice to Dalrymple as well in that. So, I mean, it's not just the negative, it's even the positive is compromised here. But I wanted to actually, I don't know whether we started late or not, but I wanted to open it up to some questions before we just sort of continued. So, is there a mic? Okay. Are there any questions for either? There you go.
This is a question for Mr. Thayil. In your book, is there the voice of Jim Morrison somewhere?
Speaking of influences.
Well, I think the voice of Jimi Hendrix intrudes at one point, and the voice of Miles Davis intrudes at one point, and the voice of R.D. Burman intrudes several times, but not Jim Morrison, no. Maybe between the lines.
I did love the little scene that there is in the book when Dimple is watching the Marodam. And because that's the kind of thing, because that was for a generation the exposure to drug culture. And it was just like a really funny scene because you were looking at it from the other end where it's like, why don't they just admit that why they get high? Because they like it.
Because they like it.
I mean, is it like you spend so much of the angst trying to figure out lost brothers and sisters, long lost in childhood, to explain why you want to do something like that. Other question? Yes.
This is for Nilanjana. If you had to base your book in a locality of Calcutta, which locality would that be? Like Jeet said that it's East Nizamuddin of Delhi. So in Calcutta, which locality do you think your cats and mongooses would inhabit?
You'd have to have a Baliganj cat or two, you know, because, but I imagine the South Calcutta cats and the North Calcutta cats might have a few differences of opinion. Not the botanical gardens, that's too obvious, but I would say a few around the Marble Palace, definitely Newmarket. Actually, yeah, Newmarket. Not Park Street. Park Street would be only for, you know, stray cat blues, something like that.
I have to admit, though, because my mother now lives in Salt Lake, totally, you know, culturally barren, I would have thought. But the cats there are like giant colonies of cats there who howl every night. It seems like, you know, all the babies have been lost then they're like mewling and howling, and packs of dogs. There's an animal kingdom thing that's happening there.
Well, they probably displaced cats, you know, castaways from the city, something of the sort.
And there are foxes too that come, and bambedals.
Okay, that does it. I have to move back.
Yes.
So I haven't read either book, but I now feel tempted to read both. So I'm going to ask you a slightly different type of question. For your generation of writers who are, if you will, perhaps the second, maybe even the third, or maybe even the fourth of sort of Indian writing in English, I wish you would speak a little bit to that very old and vexed question about English fiction in India, and how you come at it, and whether that question is even alive anymore.
You mean the question of Indian writing in English? Do you mean? And using English as the language rather than Bengali or Hindi?
No, not that
I'm so glad, because in that case I'm just going to go out for a cigarette, even though I don't smoke.
And we don't want you to start again.
I might have to with You know, because
more-
that question is
more-
280 years old. Why do you write in English? And at this point, it's just irrelevant.
No, but really, what is Indian English now? In the post imperial era, if you will, right? So not so much whether we should write in English, we have, and we are many generations into this, but more that are you hearing and writing in cadences that say depart from the Stephanian school of fiction, to use one funny but quite accurate characterization of some of the novels by writers of the post-Rushdie generation. It's really that kind of reflecting on the language now in India rather than the legitimacy of using that language is where this question comes from.
You know, the reason, I mean, I'm sure Nilanjana has a different take on this, but the reason I try very hard not to even think about this particular area is because that way paralysis lies. If you start thinking about the nature of the language you're using and how Indian English has changed and so on, and it's going to be very difficult to get on with the writing, you know. So it's sort of like a process question. I try to avoid those as well, about how do you write? Do you have a ritual? Do you have 2 cups of coffee and then you get, or do you, all those questions, I personally find it much better not to think about it because it's like a superstition the minute you start to think about them. And it's sort of like quantum physics. The actual study of the process changes the process.
I think for me what happened was realizing that one question had at least left the building some time back. In the 90s, it was all about who do you write for? And there was a tremendous anxiety about whether you could be an authentic Indian writer or whether your English was enough of a substitute for the language you had left behind theoretically in your villages or cities or whatever. So that's not where you're coming from, though. What you're asking seems to be a question of... I think one thing, absolutely, Sangeeta, one of the things that I was very aware of when I was writing is that I was probably writing in a global English and an English that no longer exists in India, except in a few small pockets. I don't think this is a bad thing either. There's a range of small bestsellers priced at about 80 or 90 rupees. Things like Love Via Telephone, Tring Tring, I Too Have a Love Story, Oh Shit, Not Again. And it's so easy to make fun of those, but I never do because I look at that language and I think, yes, this is it. This is English the way the vast majority of Indians have adapted to it today. And what they like is this short, punchy, pithy vocabulary. They don't necessarily need at this stage to have a much wider, fancy vocabulary. There's a definite dislike and distaste for ornate language. And I feel a little bit like a throwback. When I was writing, I was only conscious of not writing self-consciously in cat, I mean, which is actually a difficult problem. I mean, when you're trying to write about animals, you're also trying not to put the feathers into the eagle's voice, so to speak. And there was a dreadful section where, again, my squirrels went insane and squeaked too much. And all of that cuteness had to be removed. But I think I was very aware that some of us are just going to have to get our English from all over the place. And my English fits nowhere. It's not British because it's archaic US and UK. It's borrowed from a mashup of magazines and translations in every book I've ever read. It's got an accent, but it's got an accent that nobody can place. And I think that's the way Englishes are in the world. So that makes me, I suppose, very ordinary indeed at some level, but very different from the mainstream bestseller. Very different.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to end our session as well. Please join me in thanking Nilanjana and Jeet for sharing with us. or whatever, which finally made you think like, okay, I can possibly embark on a novel? Because there's that, there's the teenage college writer who thinks like, I will write a novel and embarks on it. But you guys were already doing a lot of other writing before getting into the novel.
What you mean to say is we were both middle-aged when we finally did our first novel, right?
Which gives me hope.
Well, it's true. I'm actually I'm past middle age, and it's a debut novel, and I had been building up to it pretty much my whole life, but I never had the resources or the time or the space in my head and around my life to actually get down to something that required kind of sustained energy over a long time. And the only way I could eventually do that was to quit the job I had, which was journalism. And I had various journalism jobs over 2 decades, each one worse than the one before. I worked for a number of we have all worked for insane, certainly a letter, maybe not love exactly, but love's twin, which we all know what that is, the darker twin. Yeah.
My relationship with Delhi, if it had been up on Facebook, would have been, it's complicated, definitely. I went there as a teenager from Calcutta, and I think I spent 4 years complaining bitterly about the fact that I'd exchanged, in my mind, a city of books for a city of very large, garish swimming pools. The first place that I went to in Delhi, for example, had a bar out there where you picked up the bottles and they played different Hindi film songs. And that in itself was fine, except that they played different Hindi film songs out of tune, And so let's just say that Delhi and I had a rough patch to begin with. This wasn't meant to be a love letter, but it started in a part of Delhi called Nizamuddin, which I love personally because it brings the best of the city together. There's a gated community where the gates have failed,
Interested in the idea of putting 3 or 4 people on a panel, because nobody ever has anything in common other than the fact that we're writers and we live in Delhi and we kind of know each other. The books are universes to themselves, but that said, we are at a literary festival, and you need a panel to kind of tie up loose ends, and fiction writers especially know that nothing is too contrived, so here we are.
Well, except for the fact that Jeet would look damn good in a sari, so we should, try fusion experiments that way. But in terms of common ground, I suppose it's only a way of looking at 2 completely different cities from the perspective of people or people who are not people, who don't usually come out. But I think that's very thin common ground. Let's explore the differences instead.
But did both of you think of the books as a love letter to the individual city? Thanks everybody for being here. So we already had the intro, so we can get right into the conversation with Jeet and Nilanjana. When I had put a status update for this on Facebook, Ruchir Joshi commented like, should I show up with a cat and inject it with a speedball and let it loose in the audience? And I was like, I don't think we need to strive that hard to find common ground here. But honestly, given the title of this panel, Dillis Billis, Bombay druggies, and the fact that you guys are both together on the stage right now, do you see any common ground, enforced or otherwise, in the sort of outsiders, characters that you have in each of your books? Outsiders, creatures that are often kicked to the curb by the larger big feet, as it were.
I'm always...
Delhi's relentless attempts to keep other people out just don't work in Nizamuddin because there's a canal that everyone has access to. And there's a lot of open spaces. There's an ancient dargah out there. And over time, I suppose, as I started looking at it from the perspective of cats, kites, and creatures who don't have a voter's ID card and therefore don't have rights in the city, something like love came in, something like that.
What is a cheel?
Oh, a chieel's like a kite.
It's a kite.
Yeah.
Yeah, because often you get a chieel's eye view of the city. And I think it might be a love letter to Nizamuddin East more than to Delhi.
But for both of you, I mean, both of you were already doing a lot of writing, journalism, poetry, reviews and things before you ventured into the novel here. So what was the, I don't know if it's the kick that propels you into that area, or whether, you know, the leap of faith